You know, this spill cam might as well be the president's poll cam. The more it leaks, the more his popularity leaks. The president will try to set things right tonight, while our panel says his speech has a nervous Wall Street hoping he can and will. Yet even those who don't necessarily flip over the big guy, with me now is Jonathan Hoenig, Lizzie McDonald, Andrew Tantaros, and Mike Norman. Mike, the argument is, again, whether Republican or Democrat, markets generally don't do well when the commander-in-chief is gasping for air.
Oh, yeah. You want clear leadership. You want forceful direction. And I think this has been completely the opposite, right? And now to go out and to use the Oval Office and to make this statement and to attack BP in the midst of what I think, anyway, are some new problems surfacing, I don't think it's going to inject any, confidence in the marketplace. And really what Obama needs to do is focus on bringing the economy back to a level where it's going to create jobs and return.
That supersedes everything.
That supersedes everything, right? So,
Andrew, what is the notion that there isn't much new the president could say tonight? I don't want that to take away your interest in our live coverage of this tonight. But in other words, he can't, 2 months after the fact, change the fact that this thing's still spewing and people are still criticizing both BP and him. So what if this he gets a temporary boost in the polls, but like State of the Union addresses and speeches before Congress that aren't State of the Union, it goes back down again.
And that very likely may happen, depending on what he does going forward. It seems like the White House is more concerned with managing the news cycle than actually managing this crisis. And I think tonight is evidence of that. He's played a supporting actor role going forward, and I think tonight he needs to do two very important things. One, let the country know that there's a sound strategy in place for dealing with what has happened, and two, that he's focused on containing it as quickly as possible and that he is in charge. Because the blame shifting, and I think no matter who does it, it makes them sound devoid of answers and weak. So him blaming Congress and blaming the media and Democrats blaming Republicans, it's just not a good scenario.
Well, he generally blames Fox, not the media. There is a distinction. But Lizzie, here's my crackpot theory on this. I think no matter what he says, you still see that thing leaking 2 months after the fact. You might have a better mechanism to repay individuals, whether it's constitutionally sound or legal or not. It's not going to move the needle.
No, I think you're right, and I think it won't move the needle because people will think, what did you do at the beginning? They'll go to the first chapter, and they'll start looking at how other presidents responded in other crises. For example, Nixon, after Camille, one of the worst hurricanes of the 20th century, in 1969, called in the troops into Mississippi, and he got the troops in there from the Defense Department, from the Army, the Air Force, the Navy. Right. He was on the stick. Nixon acted quickly, and he was applauded for it because he also redirected funds to that area, and it boosted the local economy. And so, now...
Only he were as quick with Watergate,
Yeah, well, he was quicker on the stick, a little detail. But now we have this after-the-fact refereeing of a $50 billion, whatever, fund, to help pay for the cleanup that BP hasn't even been adjudicated on. Are you allowed to do that? Are you going to pull a Russia, when Russia went after Yukos for its tax revenues,
that's a very good example.
Lost revenues, and put Yukos into a death spiral?
Jonathan, here's what I do want to raise you on. I want you to make your point as well. But the one thing that worried me going into today and going into the president's speech is that 70-some-odd% of Americans, according to the Gallup survey, really dislike BP and think it's just a basket case and a hateful, contemptible entity. They didn't say that, but I'm just cutting to the chase. So the president isn't nearly that unpopular. So he can and probably will point to BP, and could he get away with that?
Well, Neil, he can, he will. Of course, that's what we saw all day today in Washington with the hearings. Unfortunately, it's the president's job to protect people's rights, even if those people are BP. What upsets the market, from my estimation, is that uncertainty. And Emac alluded to it, that sense that almost on a daily basis, the rules are getting rewritten. The basic rules of finance in this country, property rights, private ownership, a hierarchy of ownership of a company. I mean, every day the president seems, and the administration seems to have a new way which to make BP pay. I think it forces a lot of investors simply to withdraw from the market because literally, not unlike the financial crisis 2 years ago, how can you invest for the long term when every day there's a new brainstorm idea of how to make BP pay pay what they believe is a fair estimation for the cost of the spill.
Mike, yeah, we'll let you come back. We're going to take a quick break here. We have to pay our bills here, obviously, which is more than BP can do. Anyway, in case you thought it was only BP executives Congress hated, a little show and tell in Washington today to put that once and for all to rest. Politicians hate all oil guys.
ExxonMobil's plan is a perfect metaphor for what's going wrong in the Gulf today. These plans are virtually worthless when a spill actually occurs.
Tonight.
Would you have proceeded with withdrawing the drilling fluid from the well?
There are many things.
There's only a yes or no here. I'm just asking you, knowing what we do in hindsight, would you have proceeded with withdrawing the drilling fluid from the well? Just yes or no?
Based on the information we've seen, no.
How can we feel comfortable that those that the processes and technologies will be followed? Obviously, it wasn't followed here.
We didn't have the problem. I can't answer that.
You paid your CEO 3 times more than you spent in your entire research budget to determine how to reduce the risk of catastrophic failure in the offshore oil fields. Do you think that is an appropriate prioritization for a company in your business?
Yes or no? Are you pond scum? That's how these hearings go. Big old taking it on the chin today, even though a lot of executives tried to deflect and say we're not nearly as bad as BP. They were all getting sort of tarred here. Mike, what do you make of these displays?
Look, I think each of these guys individually are trying to protect their own companies, protect the industry as a whole. They clearly threw BP under the bus. They made BP out to be, you know, the bad guy in this, which was, you know, probably the right tactical move for them as a company. But I think Andrea touched on it perfectly earlier when she said, you know, what we need to see right now is some forceful leadership. This is the plan. I'm taking control now. This is what we're going to do. It's not necessarily anymore about protecting the rights of an individual company. BP's in trouble. They're faced with a lot of financial, you know, claims right now. But we need to see leadership. And I think at least in the short term, that would help. Bigger picture, as we said before, the economy supersedes all.
Well, Andrew, we knew that BP and the BP America CEO was hated to begin with, but I was surprised that the others are almost hated as much. I mean, well, Mike, he's right that they tried to duck for cover and say, look, BP is a disaster, and it did throw them under the bus. It wasn't as if they got off scot-free. What's going on with Congress? What are they contemplating next?
Well, there's 2 reasons for these hearings. One, people dislike big companies. The only people they dislike more is Congress. These guys are in an election year. They need an enemy. So politicians are saying, we've got to shift some blame and make them look like the bad guys, not us. 2, Democrats are politicizing this to pass cap-and-trade legislation. They are trying to argue that it's just an industry-wide problem when, Neil, it's not. BP has played fast and loose with the regs for a very long time. And regulation, this isn't a partisan issue when it comes to regulation. I think that, you know...
So you're for regulation?
Some sufficient regulation Republicans are for and conservatives are for. Because, look, we don't want people cracking up their cars.
You're wearing red for that hammer and sickle that you're saying. All right, so, Lizzie, what do you make of her becoming a communist? What do you...
I'm joking.
But what do you know that this is where Congress is going?
Andrea, that's it. You're through now. Okay?
Pretty
Once
much.
he starts calling you...
I know.
What do you make of that?
Look, we've got an oil spill the size of South Carolina or Rhode Island, whatever you want to call it. And look, I have no problem calling in the oil execs and say, what are you doing? What are your safety measures? What are your preventative measures to stop another crisis like this destroying our shores and our local economies? I have no problem with that, with Congress getting on the stick there. I have problems with steroid hearings and such, but when this is...
How about oil
I have no
executives
problem
on
with
steroids?
I don't know about that. But that'll be another hearing for another day.
But, Jonathan, it just seems to me it's too easy. It's just too easy.
Well, this wasn't about solutions, Neil. This wasn't about cleaning up the oil spill. This was about humiliating CEOs and demonizing big oil, not unlike the Toyota hearings, not unlike the bank hearings. I mean, that was the purpose of today's hearings. So we heard all day long how fossil fuels are dangerous, how they're harmful, how we're addicted to oil, how we need government to come up with clean energy solutions. We'll hear about the carbon tax tonight. So Andrea's right. This will be used, and, you know, paraphrasing Rahm Emanuel, we'll use this crisis to basically ensure that gas prices go up, that oil becomes more expensive, and productivity, which we use oil to produce, becomes that much more difficult to attain.
All right, we'll be hearing from some of these folks again more this evening. In the meantime, when we come back, Mike Tyson and BP.